Welcome to part 2 of this Expert Chart Techniques in Excel tutorial where I show you how to make this cool little stock analysis chart where you can put different stocks in right here. Let's say Microsoft. You can update the chart. It's going to show you the prices. Choose what you want to appear here. You can choose different options for the dates, range, month, year, or max to show all the data you have. And it automatically updates. It's pretty cool. So in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create the macro that does all the magic that you just saw here that updates our chart. But make sure that you go ahead and watch part 1 of this tutorial so you can see how all of this is set up and created. It's kind of interesting, but more important, how to put the data into the data tab and how to set that up because that is very important. Before we start, check the video description and click the link to TeachExcel so you can download the files for the tutorial and follow along. And make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials. Now let's take a look at the macro that makes all of this happen. To get to the VBA window where we have our macros, you want to hit Alt F11 on the keyboard. Now make sure that you go ahead and download this workbook. I've got it available for you, and that way you don't have to write down all of the code that you see in this tutorial. Just download it, go to the VBA window, Alt F11, open up the module, and copy and paste this code into your macro. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the macro here to show you how to change it to work for your data set. And then, if you're interested, I'll show you basically how it works. First off, you can see that the macro is called apply filter, and it says filter data to display on a chart. So that's very important. If we go back to the spreadsheet, Alt F11, and the data tab, you'll notice that all of the data, except for the columns here, has a filter arrow above it. And that's pretty much how we do the magic over here on the chart, because the chart by default isn't going to show data in any hidden rows or columns. So most of the macro, almost all of it in fact, is going to be managing filtering, and then a little bit for hiding the columns. So first things first, we have some variables declared up here. In some of the macro tutorials, I don't cover variables too much because for most of you regular people just making small macros to make your life better, you don't need to know about it. However, here I've created a few variables and let's take a look at those. Now the variables are the containers for data. And the variables that I've created here are variables that are going to hold references to worksheets and specific ranges within the workbook. And in the macro, if you declare these variables up here, it makes it a bit easier to work with them lower in the workbook. Technically, you don't really need them, but to really understand how they work, it's best to look at the examples. So once I have declared the variables, I have a section up here that's going to basically tell the macro how everything is laid out. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to say what worksheets we have and which one is going to be used for the chart, which one for the data. I have quite a bit of comments in here, so that should help when you download the workbook. So you can see that this line here has to do with a worksheet that has the chart in it. So what we do is we use the chart sheet variable and we set it equal to our worksheet that has the chart in it. And since we're dealing with worksheets, we need to use the word set in front of it. So think of it like this. Set this variable equal to this sheet. And so we have to use sheets and the name of the worksheet right here. So first one's for our chart worksheet. Second one is where our raw data is located. And we're going to use these variables below to reference these worksheets so we don't have to enter them repeatedly in the macro. So down here where we get the user input, if I go back here, you'll see this is the user input right here. All of these cells, it's where the user can input something. And we want to get all of that into the macro. So where do we want to get it from? Well, we want to get it from the chart sheet. And where is it located? In range E4. And what do we want to get from it? The value. This is for the stock ticker example. So stock ticker, cell E4. So stock ticker on the chart sheet in range E4, get the value. So what you want to do for your workbook, just change up here, chart and data, and then change the cell references down here, E4, E6, E8. It's pretty self-explanatory, so I didn't add any comments here. We have stock ticker, the show value, date value. So stock ticker, show value, date value, then start, end, month, year, date, start, end, month, and year. So pretty simple technique so far. The next thing, which is going to help us build the macro, is to say where our data is located. So we have raw table columns title row, and raw support table start. Now raw table, or anywhere it says raw, is going to be used to reference our raw data. So raw table columns here, if we go back to the data worksheet, has to do with these columns. Let me go ahead and unhide these. So it has to do with these columns here that are going to appear on the chart itself. You don't want to include any of this meta or support data over here, just the data you want to show on the chart. So that's columns B to columns F. So raw table columns equals data sheet, because it's on the raw data sheet, and then columns, which columns B to F. We're going to use this in order to hide and unhide the columns a bit more easily. And since we're setting it equal to a range, just like with the worksheets, we have to use the word set in front of it. So it's a little bit different than these variables up here where we just set it equal to a value. You don't have to put set in front of those. So now raw table columns title row. This is something that I did to make it a little bit easier to unhide the data. So that refers to B1 to F1, which is these columns right here. So you want to set that equal to the same thing as the columns, just the very first row, or whichever row contains your headers. That's going to be used to search through later in the macro. And then raw support table start. This has to do with how a filter works in a macro, or an auto filter. So what you want to do here is you want to put, it's on the data sheet once again, and it's cell I1. You want to go over here and put the very first cell of your supplemental, your support data. So you want to have all of your support data separated from this initial table over here, the raw data table over here, have a couple columns in between, and have all of this data adjacent to one another. So no spaces in between it. This involves a potentially confusing concept, which is basically just that this over here is sort of one auto filter group. This over here is another auto filter group. They're considered separate. And when we use auto filter in the macro, you'll see that we need to know which column we are in within the auto filter group. So it's kind of like the VLOOKUP where you choose which column you want to get your data from, column 1, 2, 3, or 4. And that's kind of how this works. And you want to get the very first row, the very first column of the supplemental data, and put that here. It can be a confusing concept, I know, but just follow those steps and it'll make your life much easier. Now that I've explained that, this is really the only stuff that you need to change. If you set up your data just like this, all you need to change are the data points within quotation marks here, range references, worksheet references, and cell references. Now let's move on to the logic. So it's pretty simple actually. First, we want to make sure the cells aren't empty. So I'm going to use the variables that we just created that I just explained. I want to make sure that I have a stock ticker. So I say if the stock ticker is not equal to nothing, if the show value is not equal to nothing, and the date value is not equal to nothing. And there's a bunch of different ways you can do this, by the way. Everything that I show you here, you can do 10 million different ways. This, however, should be pretty easy compared to some of the other things you can do. So that said, we make sure that these three values are not empty. This, by the way, is the container for the entire macro below here. So it goes all the way down to the very end of the macro. So none of this code will run if it's empty. If you wanted to, you could put an else down here. So as you'll see in these examples how to do else and else if, you could put it down here to output a message that says, you didn't input a stock ticker, or you didn't input this, or you didn't input that. Please do that, and then the macro will run. So you can do all sorts of cool stuff like that. Once we've made sure that the macro should be run, the first thing that we want to do is we want to clear all filters. So I told you that the macro works by filtering the data on the raw data tab. And if you have a bunch of data that's filtered, well, it makes life easier to just blanket remove the filter from the entire worksheet before you start adding more filters. And all this does here, this if statement, is it just checks to make sure that it should remove the filter. So you don't really need to worry about that. Just make sure it should run, and then right here is the code that removes the filter. You'll notice data sheet all over the place. Remember, data sheet, here we are, is a replacement for typing this in each time. Sheets data. Next thing is the very first part. We want to know which stock ticker symbol to use. So we perform a filter on our raw data. So here you can see raw support table start. Remember I said that's supposed to be the very first cell in the first row of your support data. If we go over here, you can see that is I1, the ticker column, and that's what we want to filter by here. So we input that reference there, and then auto filter, and now field. This tells the filter which column we want to use to perform the filter. So it's 1. 1, just like I said with the VLOOKUP, is relative to this first cell over here in the auto filter group. So ticker is in column 1, so it'll be field 1. Month will be field 2, year field 3, and date field 4. We want to run a filter on field 1. Now what do we want to do? Well, I want to limit it to our stock ticker. Our stock ticker, remember, we got that guy up here. It refers to our chart sheet in range E4, and it pulls in that value. So that is exactly what we type right here. So it's going to pull in MSFT, and it's going to go here and filter the data by that stock ticker. So that's actually really simple. Choosing the stock is the easiest part of it. Now, once it's filtered that, let's move on to the next thing. The next thing is to figure out which columns to show. So the columns to show has to do with show here. Do we want to show open, high, low, close, adjusted, close, or everything? And we do that by hiding these columns here. So if we go back to the macro, what we're going to do is we're going to see what the show value is. So that's the value input on the chart sheet. If it equals all, then we want to remove any hidden values from all the columns. So what we do is we take our reference to the raw table columns, the data we want to show on the chart. Then we want to change the hidden property, and we set it equal to false. If you set it equal to true, all the columns become hidden. Now this is very important. The show value here, it checks to see if it equals all. This is hard-coded. What this means is that you have to spell this exactly the same way as it's spelled within the worksheet. In this drop-down menu right here, we see all, and we see all of these other options. These options directly correlate with checks in the worksheet. So here we only have to check for all at this point. But down here, so if we're not showing everything, we do it a little bit different. This is our section for if we need to only show specific columns. And I'll cover where the column names come into play in a moment. But first, here we want to hide all of the columns. So we reference the raw table columns, set the hidden value to true. And that makes it easier because we hide everything and then we just show one column. So that way we don't have to hide 4 separate columns. We just hide them once and then show the correct one. Now here what we want to do is we want to get the location of the column to show, as I say right here. So what we're going to use for that is .find. It's an awesome little thing here. And what we want to do is we want to get the result into a variable here. The result is going to end up being a range reference. And we go, this variable should be equal to the result of the find right here. But where do we want to perform the find? On the raw table columns title row. This is the variable we created earlier that references B1 to F1. So this data right here, the same columns that we're going to use to hide and show, we use that as the reference for the title row. And this is where the spelling comes back into play. Open, high, low, close, adjusted, close right here has to be spelled exactly the same way as it is spelled here. This makes life a little bit easier in the macro, but you just have to be careful. If your macro doesn't work, and then maybe you have a space in here between the I and the G, that could be why. So just pay attention to that. Back here, what we do is we go to the title row right here, and we want to search through it. And what do we want to find? We want to find our show value. The show value is a variable we created to get this value right here. And back here, just some other options for find, where we can say look in the formulas, look at everything, search direction, match case, false. Most of this you're not going to have to deal with, and you can leave it on the default options. The only thing you really have to change here, if you have to change anything, is where you're going to search for the data and what data you're going to search for. Once this is finished looking, it's going to return the first result, and it's going to put it inside the column title variable. Now, we have to do something with that. So we have to check if it was found. Did it find my column? Yes or no? This weird looking thing right here, if not variable name, is nothing then. Basically, it's saying, if we remove the not, it's saying if the column title is nothing, equals nothing, then do something. And we want to reverse that. We want it to do the opposite. So putting the not in front of it is saying if the column title is something, then do this. All it means is if it found a cell, do some stuff. Just written in kind of a confusing looking way. And here is where we unhide the specific column. So we go to our data sheet. We want to do something with a column. Which column? Well, we need to get the column from our column title range reference. The column title, remember, holds the cell that contains the value that was found. So it's which column to unhide. We want to get a column from it, so we do dot column, and that's passed to this. So we're working on a column, and we want to set the hidden value equal to false. So that's it. We hide all the columns, then we find the one that we want to unhide, then we unhide it. Now let's go to dates. This might look confusing, but you should kind of understand how it works by this point. There's only really one thing that's a little different here. So first we have a bunch of if and else if statements. And this is going to allow us to figure out which option for the date we chose here. Did we choose range month, year, max? What do we choose? We use the date value variable we created, and we figure out what it's equal to. Is it equal to range, month, year, and so on. Once again, this is where spelling is important, because if you spell it wrong, it's not going to work. Now, once you know which option the user selected, do something. So I'm going to come back to the very first one in a moment, but let's go to the other ones, which are a little bit easier to do. Let's say we're going to filter by a specific month. Remember how the filter works? We first need to get the very first cell in our filter group, which is this right here. Then we need to figure out the field it's in, and then the criteria. This is our first cell in our filter group. This is column 1. Month is column 2. So we use 2 to filter on column month. And you pretty much know how it works now. So raw support table start, I1, perform a filter. On which field? Field 2. What's our criteria? Date month. And it's a very simple filter because we created the month column and we just put in here, what is it? 1 to 12. So over here for the month, you just put 1 to 12. So it's easy. You can't really mess it up, and it makes making the macro a bit easier as well. For the year, we do the exact same thing, but we change the field to 3 because it's in the third column of our filter group. And the criteria is date year. Now when we do month and year combined, we just put both of these statements up here together. So field 2, field 3, criteria date month, criteria date year. Now when we get down to max, we don't do anything. Remember, the filter has been cleared before we get here, and max is going to show everything. So we don't have to filter by dates, so we do nothing. But I left that here just so you don't get confused, or maybe you want to add something there, a little message box for the user. Now let's go back up here where we actually have to filter based on dates. So we have the same filter setup, raw support table start. This time we want to do it on field 4. If you watch the first tutorial, you know that these are stored as dates. Over here, they're not actual dates, just text. So that's very important. We want to perform the filter on the date real. Now the criteria. The criteria is a bit different here. We need to figure out if the data points fall between two dates. Dates in Excel are stored as numbers, so we can use the greater than and less than sign to figure this out. So the criteria is to check if the date is greater than, and here we have to enter this to do the date. So date start is our field on the chart table. So it's right here. It's where the user inputs the data. And this part right here is the format. So it's the format of the date that we want the macro to have. So we're changing the date format, and that's important because the date format changes based on where you are in the world. And you want to keep it nice and simple for the macro. So format is going to change our date that the user inputted into this format right here. And then it's going to add a little greater than sign to it for the criteria. So this says criteria 1, make sure it's greater than our dates. Now we go down here to the next line. By the way, if you want to put this on multiple lines, you need to put the little underscore right there. That's what allows you to break this up on multiple lines. Next thing is we need an operator, because here we're going to use criteria 1 and criteria 2 for our filter. So the operator says, what do we want to do between criteria 1 and criteria 2? You have a bunch of different choices. Here I'm choosing Excel and. So it basically means it's going to apply criteria 1 and criteria 2. For criteria 2, we do basically the same thing as we did on the first one, except for here we use less than or equals to, and then format the date the exact same way. And this is the last thing that we do for the macro. So we work with the dates, and that's it. So that's all there is to this macro. It may seem like a lot. I spent a lot of time trying to explain the intricacies or every little individual part, and I really wanted to walk you through it because I hate when someone shows a giant piece of code on the internet and just expects you to know everything already. So I spent a lot of time doing that, but if you follow this format, or you just download this workbook and change what you need, you shouldn't have to make too many alterations for your workbook. If you do want to make alterations, it shouldn't be that difficult. It should be pretty easy to expand them, and most of what you have to do is just to change these values up here. Maybe add a few variables if you want to check for something else, and you can use the format that I have down here with the auto filters and the if statements to pretty much do whatever else you want. All you're going to be doing is additional filters for the most part. Now let's go ahead and check it out once again. So here I have added Microsoft as an additional stock. So we have two ticker symbols now. Google, let's say I want to do Google again. Open, date, let's get a year. How about 2016? And update chart. How great is that? Now, if you see all these dates down here, if it's in a format that you don't like, go ahead and format the chart however you want. And also remember that it's not going to show every single date down here for every single column of data. That's just not going to fit on the chart. So don't freak out if you go ahead and change this to, let's say, month, hit update chart, and it doesn't exactly look right. Looks like they're skipping some days. Yeah, that's because they couldn't fit all the dates on there. Also, to assign the macro to a button like this, all you do is make your button like I showed you in the first tutorial, right click, go to assign macro, choose your macro, and hit OK. And now you have a macro assigned to your button. If you want to go ahead and edit the button later instead of clicking the macro, just right click the button and you can get back to all of your edit options. Now this is actually a very simple template. The thing about templates, they take you a long time to make, but it's going to save you a lot of time. And when you look at all of this, when you think of the macro that's behind it, it may seem like, wow, so much is done, but there is so much more that you could do. What I wanted to do is I wanted to show you some of the skills that are used to create this kind of an interface so that you can realize two things. One, it's not that difficult. A lot of the code over here is just repeated. It's just a lot of repetition. A lot of if statements, a lot of filters, and then in a few places some things are a little different, like with the date formats here, and we find the column title here. But for the most part, with what you've seen here, you will be able to go out and create a chart like this and expand it to add more features and more things. And this brings us to a nice little homework assignment. Go ahead, download this file, and add another data input field here to choose if you want to display daily, weekly, or monthly data for a stock. I promise you, it's almost exactly the same as what we've done before. And if you want, you can submit that homework assignment to teachexcel.com. You can go to the forum there. Just put the word homework in the title, surround it with brackets, and you can submit it, ask for help, or if you just want to show off what you did, No problem, and you can get help with it there. But for this tutorial, that's it. This is the final part for 6 expert chart techniques in Excel. I hope you liked the tutorial. If it was helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.